When we have time for questions, feel free to come up to the microphone. Go ahead and pretend it's an ice cream cone and just get real close to it. This allows us to be inclusive of everyone in the room and also our friends who are joining us online. So please go ahead and speak into the microphone so everyone can hear your question or comment. I'm going to start us with prayer. Almighty God, we praise you and give you thanks for life and for all children who start life in innocence, laughter, and play. Make us mindful of the world's children in the name of your beloved Son, Jesus Christ, our Savior, who took them into his arms and blessed them. Amen. So this morning, I have the honor of introducing the Reverend Dr. Danielle Hansen. She is at Candler Seminary, serving as Assistant Professor of Practical Theology and Spiritual Care. She's also the Director of the Chaplaincy Concentration. Prior to Candler, she was on faculty of the Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas, and she's taught courses on trauma, practical theology, pastoral theology, with a feminist, intersectional, and anti-racist lens. Tumminio Hansen has been a lecturer at Yale and Tufts University, and she's also served as a parish priest and is the author of several works in practical theology. Conceiving Family, a practical theology of surrogacy and self. God and Harry Potter at Yale. Expecting Jesus, a series of Advent daily reflections. And she is also the co-editor of When Two or Three Are Gathered, an anthology of spiritual vignettes composed by a diversity of individuals throughout the Episcopal Church. She has also written extensively for publications including Huffington Post and The Guardian about the intersection of popular culture and faith. So please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Danielle Tumminio Hansen.
It's just been an embarrassment of riches the last couple of months, right? We have to figure out how to share because it's remarkable. I'm glad we get to stream these. Thank you all for being here today. And my expectation, my hope, is that Danielle will be around more, so we'll have more opportunity for conversation. And today, I will remember to stop at 10:50 and at least, and maybe a little earlier, and there will be time for questions. We'll make sure to do that. So first, because we hope to see you again, I'd love it if you'd introduce yourself to us. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I moved to Atlanta this summer with my family. I have a husband and 3 children. I also live with my mother. So we have a lot of us who are in Atlanta. I'm a lifelong Episcopalian. I grew up in a suburb of New York on Long Island called Rockville Center, and as a very small toddler, kept asking questions about God, and my parents didn't really want to take me to church. They were both lapsed Catholics. And so they took me to the Episcopal Church, which was familiar to them. And when I was old enough, they usually just dropped me off and left and came back for me.
So we're for that.
Yeah. And I spent a lot of my childhood singing in a cathedral girls' choir. That was very important to my faith development, my love of music. It was the place where I feel like I came to know God very closely. And so when I went to college, I continued to sing and kind of made my way into divinity school, not quite knowing what I wanted to do there, but very much knowing that what I knew about faith was important to me and I wanted to wrestle with it. So that eventually kind of led me to the priesthood and academia. So that's who I am.
And did you go to Yale for your divinity degree?
I did.
And for your doctoral work?
No, I went to Yale for my undergraduate degree, and then I have 2 master's degrees from Yale. My doctorate is at Boston University.
Just wanted to be, yeah. And so when you were at Yale, did you work with Serene Jones?
I did. Mm-hmm.
So Serene Jones is currently the president of Union Seminary and works on trauma and grace. Very she's a Calvinist, right?
Yes.
So I would assume that's not your approach necessarily.
No.
Right. But Serene is one of the people that you know. And your work begins in trauma, is that right? And how did you come to that?
Yeah, so my second year in divinity school, this very well-known theologian named Serene Jones taught a class called Trauma and Grace, and that, I believe it was the first year she taught it, and she eventually wrote a book. The book now has a second edition. And what she did in that class was encourage us to learn about the social science of trauma, how it works in the body, how it works in the mind, how philosophers have wrestled with trauma. And there were a couple of books in that class that just sort of, like, it was like a light went off of not only is this really interesting, but it's interesting in a way that I really feel called to continue to wrestle with. And so I took what I learned in her class and stayed to do another master's degree, and she was very important in the work I did in that also, and then worked with a prior student of hers on my doctorate who was also studying trauma. So I've always been interested, since I took that class, in how trauma affects how we understand who we are and how we make meaning out of the world around us, and how these moments of entering into a liminal space, into a traumatic space, kind of cause us to reevaluate all of that, often including our relationship to God.
Did you just kind of equate a traumatic space and a liminal space?
I did.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so I think traumatic spaces are very much liminal spaces. They take us out. So a liminal space is a space that's sort of out of the ordinary for some reason. And I think traumatic spaces take us into these liminal spaces, or these out of the ordinary spaces, for a few reasons. One is they take us out of our sense of self. And so the way you identify yourself, how you know yourself, and your relationship to the world often gets destabilized or even eradicated in a traumatic experience. And who you are in relationship to your community then gets destabilized or eradicated as well. And so there are these questions of who am I in relation to the world, in relation to God, and that's one reason you enter into this liminal place. But the other, I think, has to do with time. That the way people exist in time and trauma is very curious, because normally we think of time as going like, you just move through time. Although there was just this NPR article that I saw that time is not what we think time is. I don't know anything about that. So I'm just going to talk about how we perceive time. So we're kind of moving through time, but then you have this traumatic event, and one of the ways your brain works in trauma is that your brain gets stuck trying to understand what's going on. So like time keeps going on, but you actually like kind of go here, and time keeps going. It feels like it goes on without you. And so this is another reason you're in this liminal space, because you exist in time very differently.
So I'm going to come back to that because we have to talk about that. But before I lose my timeline, and how did you discern and for priesthood and become a priest and do that in the middle of this path?
Yeah. I think part of it was that I saw so many models of parish priests as a child, and felt like that was the only thing that a priest could do. But I also was not exposed to women priests as a child. So the Episcopal Church ordained women in the 70s, but I was part of a diocese that did not. And so the first woman priest I saw was when I was about 12 or 13, and it was a momentary encounter because I was singing and I was coming for a rehearsal, and I had come downstairs for the rehearsal, and there was some, diocesan-wide event that the cathedral often hosted, and it was letting out. So there was a woman wearing a collar who was kind of leaving, and I thought it was weird. I thought it was curious because I had never seen anything like that, and I had no conception that was something a woman could do. So I just went up to her and said, I don't understand. And, and she said, and one of the questions I asked her was, I don't understand what to call you, because we call everyone here Father. And she said, well, you call me Reverend or you can call me Mother, but everyone just calls me Pamela, and that's my name. And it really stuck with me because as a child, everyone is Mr. or Mrs. or Doctor or Father. And when she said you could call me Pamela, it humanized her in a way that I had never really seen before. And it stuck with me so profoundly. Where the cathedral I sang in did get a woman who was a deacon when I was just before I graduated from high school, and I talked to her quite a bit. But I was very young, and the Episcopal Church was at that time not ordaining as many young people, and I was still trying to understand what I wanted to do because I loved church and didn't feel called to be there all the time. And this idea that you could even do this as a woman was pretty new to me. So it took a lot of time to sort all those pieces out. Yeah. But when I did finally feel that call more certainly enough that I wanted to pursue it, right before I got ordained, I did find this Pamela, and she came to my ordination.
Oh.
And it was very special.
Oh, you can call us all Pamela.
Yeah.
I love that. Oh. And so were you ordained in Connecticut?
I was.
Yeah. Okay, so back to where we were.
Yeah.
Time. Just very specifically in the world of foster care.
Yeah.
It just strikes me as a place where there'd be so many points of trauma.
Yes.
I don't even know how to engage the conversation, but I know a number of the families in our church are a part of the foster care system. And I have friends that that have participated in different ways. First maybe tell us how you encountered that system, and then let's talk about.
So when I moved to Austin, I heard an ad on the radio. It might have been the country music station to go and volunteer as a CASA. And a CASA is a court-appointed special advocate for children, or also called a guardian ad litem. And so legally, you're in charge of advocating for the child's well-being in court. And so every CASA is given one family's worth of children, and they go through the foster care system with them. I'm told it operates very differently, really county by county. So even where I was in Travis County in Texas, CASAs worked very differently than in the county next door. And I haven't been in Atlanta long enough to know what the CASA program is like here. But in Travis County, it was a very active, involved program in the foster care system. And the judges, the social workers, the lawyers, everyone was very committed to working with the CASAs, and CASAs were very engaged in the lives of the family they were assigned to. So I had one family's worth of children, and my children were in the foster system for much longer than other families on average stay in the system, and the average is long. It's over a year. So I really had a chance to get to know this one family's worth of children, and I discovered a lot of what you would expect to discover in foster care. And so, the statistics are really sobering in terms of the number. I think it's 1 or 3% of foster children who graduate from college. Very few of them get jobs. Their foster children on average have 7 placements that they go through. And they leave those placements for a variety of reasons, and they're put into those placements for a variety of reasons. So, one of the things that really stood out to me was everyone who's part of that family, whether it's the biological parents or the parents who are caring for the children or the children themselves, are in vulnerable positions. And they're in vulnerable positions for different reasons, but many of them are coming out of trauma or even continuing to experience trauma within the system. And it takes so much more than one person to respond to that trauma. So, in the lives of one child, I often think it takes a community to create any trauma, and it then takes a community to respond to any trauma. And when our communities are so fractured and destabilized and underfunded, and when systemic oppression is hanging over all of it, it makes it so hard for these children to move forward, and for the parents to move forward, and for the foster families to move forward, and and it's just very hard and humbling. So one of the things I did learn a lot about was how children process trauma, which was not something I knew a ton about before. I tended to focus my research on adults, and it doesn't present quite the same way. So play with children is a really important way to engage and build trust. And oftentimes when children experience trauma, their emotions can be very wild and seem like adults, seem irrational to the moment. It doesn't make sense they would have that emotion in that moment. But I was telling Winnie, like, trauma's like a cup, and if you keep pouring water in, it's got to go out somewhere. And your hope is that it comes out in a safe place. And oftentimes when children have these emotions that seem so loud and so big, it's because they're in a space that feels safe to them, and those emotions have to go somewhere to be processed. And in some ways, it's worse when they don't come out. So I learned all sorts of things from that experience.
Explain something about church as well, right? That a lot happens, right? A lot happens here. We hope it feels safe. Can I the fundamental question, I think, in the space that you study, and I just want, why do bad things happen, right? It's the beginning of the Bible, too. Why? And I would guess that space of studying trauma is you're kind of getting at that question, right? Mm-hmm. And then what happens to us when bad things happen to us? And so you've just said it takes a community to create trauma, mm-hmm. and most of us experience trauma in our lives as a person. Someone did something to us. So explain what you mean by it takes a community.
Yeah, so I think, and my assertion it takes a community falls apart a little when we talk about an illness or even a natural disaster, especially if that natural disaster isn't caused by climate change, then it did take a community. But you're right, when we often think of a trauma as something that one person did, or you can point to that one person or those two people. But what made that one person into that one person? What made, it wasn't just in isolation that person did what they did. So, it may have been that their parents raised them poorly. Their teachers did not give them the support they needed. They were in underfunded schools. They didn't receive the therapy they needed. Or, and I think you see this a lot in gender-based violence or violence that's motivated by racism. A system of individuals said, your way of being in the world, your way of practicing relationships to other genders or other races is fine. It's okay to engage with the world this way. And then when you're told this is okay over and over again, then, that winds up justifying the harm that then one individual experiences. So I often talk about how, the things that we think of as traumas, I think if you look in the news, they tend to be very, what I call exotic, is how I write about it. They're exotic traumas. They're sensationalized traumas. But trauma can emerge from so many other things that don't make news stories because they seem dull or unnotable. Like a movie director would never put that on the screen. But I think those are the things that also then enable the kinds of exotic things that we wind up paying attention to. And all of it is a problem. We have to work together on all of it.
So as a priest, with this scholarship, as your work, what does that mean for church communities if we want to be places that engage well or appropriately?
Yeah. So there's a mental health expert named Judith Herman who wrote kind of one of the most important textbooks on trauma. It's called Trauma and Recovery. She talks about 3 stages of trauma and recovery, and the first is creating safety. The second is creating opportunities for meaning making, or she also calls it remembrance and mourning. And then the third is reconnection. And I think faith communities can be involved in all 3 of those. The safety piece is the one I think we pay the least attention to, and it's also the most important because you can't do anything without it. So physical safety, psychological safety, spiritual safety, is all embedded in that safety piece. And so as a faith community, you can create spiritual safety by engaging in spiritually grounding practices like prayer, singing together, worship. I think our worship is such a gift because it's pretty stable. You know what to expect. And that groundedness for someone who has experienced trauma can be really important to them, to creating that spiritual safety. So that's one really unique thing that I think a church can offer that sets them apart. And then the same for meaning making. That remembrance and mourning piece is very much embedded in our liturgical work together. We get some language that has been meaningful to others that we can draw on, and it gives people a place to wrestle with whether it's meaningful to them. And if it's not, that's a conversation that they can have because they feel safe. And if it is, how wonderful to have that solidarity and to have an opportunity to make meaning in a community in relation to God. And then that third piece, that reconnection piece, tends to come later when a lot of this processing has done. So reconnection often involves advocacy or public speaking or educational work, something like that. A feeling that you've integrated a sense of self into that trauma, and you're going to try to use that for good. And again, all that work can take place in a church as well, because we all want to help make the world into the world God intends to be. So it's a natural place for someone to bring their gifts.
Is it? I mean, and the things you've described are things, those, as you said, those are things that happen in church or could happen in church. Is it important to name it? I mean, that we're in trauma informed and this is how that works, or we think about, or is it just so organic that people find their way to it?
Oh, I mean, in some ways I would say both, because it never hurts to name, and it often helps to name. Because when things go unnamed, they're either overlooked or people can't find a home in them. So I think naming is important for that reason, but doing the work is more important, and being in the world in a trauma-informed way.
So what would a church like St. Luke's have? What should we be thinking about if we want to be a place like that?
Yeah. I think that probably the most important thing is just to be educated about how trauma works in people's lives, and how prevalent it is. So there's a scale that measures, it's called the ACEs scale. It measures adverse childhood experiences, the kind of experiences that tend to yield a trauma reaction. And 8 out of 10 individuals will have had at least, I think it's 2 of these experiences by the time they're 18. So that's just by the time you're 18. So my guess is just about everyone in this room has been exposed to a potentially traumatizing experience, which is not the same as saying you have post-traumatic stress. Those are different things, but that kind of wrestling, I think, is just about universal. So understanding that is so important for faith communities. And then I think believing people is the other thing I would say, because oftentimes individuals who have been traumatized feel very isolated for a number of reasons and feel like they can't say anything because it's uncomfortable, because it rocks the boat, because they won't be believed. And being open enough to hear their story is part of what transforms the trauma. So we know that speaking about trauma literally changes how it functions in the brain, but a traumatized person can only speak if people will listen. So having, really good listening practices is the last thing I would say. Asking open-ended questions, leaving some space for silence, just hearing the person, receiving what they're saying, all of that is really important.
And kind of going back to foster care, how do you So if we at St. Luke's, we're listening to your story, we have CASA here in Atlanta as well, and we have foster families here. How do we put these pieces together? Right? If you've got these kids that have, just by definition, it is traumatic to be removed from your family, and probably because traumatic things were happening in your family, to then be with these lovely, well-intended people who've probably had very different lives, which must be the other kind of odd part of foster care, right? Than the kids that are, the families that people come into are very different often.
Yep.
So how do we as a church, what does it mean for us to be supportive?
Yeah. So they're in the very definition of a liminal space, right? So I think that's the first thing. When individuals have been traumatized, they often experience a lack of agency. So something has been taken from them. And that's that's the heart of being in the foster system, is that you didn't have agency in terms of what happened to you in the first place that brought you into care, how long you're going to be in that placement. None of that is under your control. And so I think one of the things you can do that can be really valuable is to ask the child, what do you need right now? What would you like? What would make you happy right now? What would you like to do? So as a CASA, I would go once a month to my foster children and just spend time with them, like take them to McDonald's, or bring a board game and we'd play a game, get down on the floor and just be with them in this play space. That's what part of what feels safe to them. So asking, what do you need? What's important to you is an important way to return agency to everyone, including children, when it's been taken away.
That seems so simple.
It is simple.
Yeah. I think we can do that. That seems very simple.
Yeah.
So kind of go back to the beginning. Serene's work is trauma and grace. So do you use a similar category? Do you think about grace as it relates to trauma, or if not, what is your sense of, and maybe you've already talked about it, what the tradition brings in light of how we understand trauma?
Yeah. I do think about grace a lot, and I don't write about it as much as she does, in part because of her background as a Calvinist. But I think she and I really agree on the role that systemic sin plays in bringing about trauma. So, like I said, I don't tend to see traumas as being individual. I tend to see them as being very corporate, and that a lot of us are complicit in ways we don't even know or acknowledge. And it makes us more accountable than we think we are, which means we need to do more to make things right. And I think the way grace comes into that is that whether we're the traumatized individual or part of their community, to have the humility to kind of step back, especially if we're not the traumatized individual and just part of the community, to step back and say, what is God really telling us right now? What can I hear beyond the noise of this world? And then how can I live by it? I think opens the possibility to kind of dilute the power of that systemic sin and let grace be more of a presence.
Are you talking about our theological imagination?
I am.
Towards social justice?
Yes.
Is that, yeah? That makes me very happy. I can't believe I'm asking this, but where do you see the place of individual responsibility in these issues and accountability?
Yeah. So I'm also a restorative justice practitioner, and that frames a lot of how I think about accountability. I think in our society we've been taught often to think that punishment is meaningful accountability. And if you look at studies of children, how we discipline children, one of the things you learn is punishment is not very effective in changing children's lives or minds or ways of being. And that's because when you punish a child, you teach them, if anything, you teach them to be afraid of doing the wrong thing, but you haven't taught them how to do the right thing. So, and I think the same is true of adults. When we use only punishment, at its best, and this is at its best, you make someone afraid of doing the wrong thing, but you haven't helped them to do the right thing. I think when you add that with the way we've created the prison system in our country, it's not even doing what punishment can do at its best. It's doing very harmful things in people's lives. Having said that, I think the prison system as a concept, not as it is in our country, has a place because sometimes individuals are not capable of learning how to do the right thing, and they need a timeout, sometimes a giant timeout. But I tend to be very optimistic about people and hopeful, and some of that comes from my faith, and that I don't really want to live in a world where I have to think that poorly of human beings. And my hope is that instead of most people needing that timeout, what most people need is an opportunity for meaningful accountability and a chance to make things right. And to do that, you really have to hear and understand what you've done wrong. And that means listening to the people and the communities that you've harmed and hearing from them, this is what needs to be done to make things right. So that's that return of agency to the harmed party, but it also gives the person who perpetrated harm an opportunity to say, this is why I did it, and this is how I'm going to live differently from now on to make amends and not enact harm further.
It's amazing. I remembered that there should be time for questions. So if you'd like to ask a question, you have to go to that microphone. So if anyone would like to do that, you're invited to. I bet Neil Shorthouse has a question.
You said that probably 20% of us have had some traumatic experience. Is that what I heard?
Oh, no, much higher, probably close to 100%. Yeah,
What was the percent?
close to 100, quite
all,
high.
All of us, okay.
Yeah.
But maybe there was some percentage about that is particularly injurious to certain children. And could you say something about that in the context of what you said, that trauma is systemic, not just that there's a system
Sure.
that creates this. So if you
Yeah.
could say something about that, that would be good.
Yeah, so this measure that I talked about, the ACEs scale that measures childhood adverse experiences, so I believe it's about 80% of people by the time they reach 18 have had, I think, 2 of these experiences, but a large number of people have had more. So one of the things, when you have experienced a potentially traumatizing experience, you're more likely to have distressing symptoms from that event if you've had a history of those events in the past. So there's just so far, we talk about resiliency, like there's just so far resiliency is gonna go if you have a huge history of trauma. So you're more likely to process that as post-traumatic stress. So that's one thing. But I think the way that we systemically respond even to one experience of trauma in someone's life is part of why individuals may struggle more than they should. So it's really, for instance, it's really hard to get good mental health care in our country. And so even if a person has one adverse experience that they'd like some support on, it might financially be out of reach, it might be geographically out of reach, all sorts of reasons you can't access that care. And that's part of how the system isn't supporting individuals. So then if that individual then has another negative experience, it's harder for them to process now the compounding stress that has come. Not to mention the fact that, like I said, I feel like a lot of times trauma emerges because of a community. So it's just sort of a lack of support in so many ways.
Like an example I was thinking of is when I was in high school, there were kids in our high school that had come from Ethiopia from the war. And there were kids that had lived there for a while because their families had fled Vietnam and come out of the refugee camps in Vietnam. And I don't want to speak to their mental health, but they were my friends, but they knew exactly what had happened to them. It had happened to their whole community. And I remember some of the guys from Ethiopia, they looked shell-shocked from what they had seen. But there was a collective understanding of what had happened to their communities that made their experience very different than other people in our friendship groups that had these dissonant experiences in their lives, right? Is that? Yeah.
Yes. So this is where naming comes in quite a bit. It's hard to move past a trauma you can't name. And so the area of research that I spend the most time on are actually the things that we're not naming, either because the language isn't there or people can't hear it, or the way that we have as an entire culture framed what trauma should be doesn't seem to apply. And it's very hard to move past a trauma that's difficult to name. And in some ways, when you have a whole community that can point to, we experienced this together, it certainly doesn't make it better, but it does make it nameable and identifiable in a very different kind of way.
Sorry, do others have questions? Yeah. Do you want to go to the microphone? Yeah. Are you going to the microphone? Yeah. Okay.
Do you have any thoughts to share about how schools fit in as either exacerbating the trauma or a place to help heal it?
Yeah, oh, that's such a great question. My parents were both public school teachers, and my husband's a teacher, and I spent some time in a school myself, so I have a lot to say about schools. One thing I heard a school administrator tell me recently was, we haven't decided what the purpose of schools are in the United States.
Oh my God.
Are they primarily educational institutions? Are they primarily social service agencies? What are they setting out to do? And part of me wishes we had a mission statement for schools, like not just one, I know individual schools have a mission statement, but that we collectively agreed, here's what we're promising our children. And so I do think, well, we owe safety to our children, first and foremost. A school should be safe. And I think one of the things that we've seen from news stories is that schools aren't as safe as they should be. So that's the first thing. And we need really great teachers who feel pride in what they are doing and feel that they're supported by parents, by the community. And that also, I think we're not doing in all the ways that we should. And of course, we also need more access to mental health support for students. And that includes, I think, making social emotional learning a part of the curriculum in the same way we make social studies a part of the curriculum, because you don't just want your child to know things, you want them to know how to be kind in the world. And I think we forget that's something you have to learn.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hello. My question is about the intersection of trauma and faith that you discussed. Mm-hmm. So my faith background is primarily not Episcopalian, but the way that you talk about wrestling with it is very interesting. From my background is that God brings you out of trauma. Mm-hmm. So it's almost as if your faith allows you to transcend it or get beyond it, as in the God leading the children of Israel out of Egypt, different examples like that. But what you seem to be saying is that faith is a place for you to wrestle with it. Mm-hmm. And I have also recently begun hearing more about how trauma is passed down, even in the DNA.
In generations.
So hearing all of that and what you're saying now with what I've heard about faith in the past where God brings you out is, I don't know what I'm asking, but it's just kind of interesting how to make sense of all that.
Yeah, so to the intergenerational piece first, I've talked about how trauma moves through time this way, but trauma also moves through time this way. So there's a horizontal plane to trauma and then a vertical plane to trauma. And you may see this if you look at your family systems, how your families, I'm going to just take a guess that some of you have difficult or interesting families. And you might see how the traumas of your families have passed down to make your family function the way it does. So to the piece of faith, I tell my students all the time, you don't want to take away someone's belief that's working for them unless you have something way better to offer. And I've I've heard from many individuals who have very certain meanings of why certain things have happened to them, and they take great solace in that and feel God's presence, or they feel like God has answered their prayers for blank. And who am I to say that that is not the case? I don't have that kind of divine. That's God's work, not mine. And I receive their stories with delight and awe. And then I also talk to people who say, I don't understand why God did this to me, and who aren't having that experience. And I'm happy to get down in the mud and wrestle with them, because that's a really interesting question to ask. And you need people to ask it with. So I try to encounter all of those experiences of trauma, not from a place of feeling like I have the answers, but from a place of feeling like I'm still a student and trying to learn alongside them.
Thank you. Thank you. Will you all help me thank Danielle for this conversation?
Thank you.
Some of us are going to go to church. I think Danielle might stick around for a minute if you want to stay in
Yeah,
conversation,
absolutely.
and you'll help me convince her that she wants to come back. Thank you.